Thank you, Jeroen. Good morning. We're on education today, and I'm going to start with the first educational approach after the Renaissance. And just as with the classicists in art, so here it was inspired by the ancients. It came to be called classical education, and it ruled Western schools for a very long period of time, about 3 centuries. It didn't really lose its sway until the mid or late 19th century. And a form of it is now enjoying a modest resurgence, but now as dissent from the establishment, not as the dominant trend. Classical education defines education as the study and mastery of the works, culture, and society of the ancients, Greek and Roman, especially their literature and language, and particularly Latin. The basic ground of their view was the conviction that Greco-Roman civilization was not merely great, but the greatest possible to man, immeasurably superior to virtually anything, leaving aside, of course, Christian contributions to civilization, superior to anything which had or would come after it. In this view, the ancients were not the key to a brilliant new human future, but were rather regarded as revered authorities who in effect were used to bar or demean cultural progress. To show you how widespread this view was, even such an independent critic as Benjamin Franklin wrote that, quote, "The finest writings, the most correct compositions, the most perfect productions of human wit and wisdom are in the Greek and Latin languages. Those languages contain all science," unquote. This is in the 18th century. Given its defining commitment, classical education favored the traditional over the modern, the arts and humanities over technology and science, and the student's grasp of a philosophical/religious view of life over vocational training. The educational choice they held is an orientation to the profound or to the worldly, to the timeless or the trendy, the theoretical or the practical, the spiritual or the materialistic. And you can see the Platonic nature of these dichotomies. They stressed that there was one important secular benefit of their intellectual approach, and that was its development of the student's faculty of reason. And the way it was commonly put is, our education sharpens the mind of the student. By fostering each child's intensive study and understanding of the classics they held, the schools thereby instill in his mind the method of logic and the rigor of mental discipline. And these skills, in turn, enable him to deal with broad abstractions clearly and incisively in a way otherwise unattainable. And its power to teach these skills was thought to be one of the chief benefits of learning Latin, which was widely viewed as uniquely logical and therefore as a perfect teacher of thought, uniquely logical in its grammar and syntax. Now, to sharpen a mind, they held a definite method of presentation in the classroom as necessary. The student must be given not a jumble or miscellany of data, but a logical, structured progression of rational principles. And to structure their curriculum, the classicists typically adopted a long-standing practice of the medievals, the practice of starting the child with what was called the Trivium, Trivium, from 3, not from trivial. This means his exclusive immersion during his earliest, most formative years in 3 subjects, each presented as a precondition of the next: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then these 3 having been completed, the child's mind was then regarded as basically molded. He was now prepared to deal rationally with the more advanced subjects, including pagan thought and all its riches. Now, from the point of view of mode of integration, the Trivium is the most important part of the classical curriculum because it illustrates in its purest form how the child was taught to think. First, the child masters Latin, the language of the great books, including the rules of Latin grammar, which were considered as preeminently mind-sharpening. Now, this is a formidable assignment, and it was commonly given for a period of years to children 6 years old or younger. And of course, that established the atmosphere and the nature of the schools from the earliest grades, and they quickly came to be called what they still are called grammar schools, which indicates the primacy of grammar in these schools. Now, their elevation of grammar to a position of educational primacy eloquently reflects their basic commitment. The study of antiquity, in this case the language of antiquity, as against of nature, of rational intellectual constructions as against the scattered empirical observations of men of their era, of eternal books as against what were regarded as the nascent scientists' alleged facts, or at least educationally irrelevant facts about gravity and stuff like that. In other words, the primary object of study was text over empirical data. In other words, words apart from the world, which leaves only one primary subject of study in the classroom, the relationship of words to one another, which is precisely the real and proper subject of grammar. So if you remember Plato's idea of learning thought by deliberately interrelating pure universals to one another, this is here clearly reflected in the classroom's interrelating of pure language, pure words. And then it follows from that, sequences of words are sentences. So when you get to the sentences, and what studies sentences? Logic. Logic is a study of the relationship among sentences. What sentences follow from which? And then rhetoric studies the methods of gaining one mind's concern to the sentences of another. So the classicists had the child in a world of language and the manipulation of language, of detached linguistic study, and in his early years, with emphasis on much mechanical drill in the rules of Latin. Now, these rules were commonly presented as self-contained, bearing little contact with the empirical world. That's the way the Romans spoke. And often they were presented without the student even reading anything written in Latin. And there are cases, not many, this is the extreme, of vocabulary lists presented to the students to memorize without reference to perceptual objects. Just one word defined in terms of a bunch of other words with no idea of what objects the words refer to. Now, once Latin was presumed to be known, then the educational horizons broadened. But the focus often continued in a similar vein. They would start to read the great works of the Greeks and Romans, but the focus was not so much on what a great man had actually said, but on the sentences he used, their structure, their clarity, their logic, their elegance. In other words, the way the words were put together. And then later, when vernacular languages became popular in education, French, English, and so on, and not just Latin and Greek, the emphasis was on the methods of achieving accurate and eloquent translations into the vernacular. So the students lived and thought for years in a world of linguistic rules, sentences, names, which were essentially to them pure abstractions, pure concepts. Now, the Platonism here provoke continual, though largely ineffectual, criticism from empirically minded reformers. And here's John Locke, quote, and what he says is 100% true. Quote, "Our education fits us for disputing about abstractions as against living, for the university as against the world," unquote. Completely true. Now, lectures dealing with abstractions apart from things are very difficult for most people, especially youngsters, to understand or to retain. So as a rule, the schools solve this problem by requiring rote memory of their students, and then when that failed, discipline, ranging from bullying of the student in class to painful beatings and whippings. You can read Dickens to see what that was like. Now, to the classicists, it is obvious that a teacher should enunciate in class philosophical principles and values that are not subjective, but universally applicable and absolute. We're in the 17th, 18th century. Subjective is wholly unpopular. However, the younger students could not, for the most part, understand or prove these principles, partly because many of them were straight out of the Bible. So they had to accept them as a rule on faith, simply as more dogma. Now, these classes were, of course, rationalists, along with the whole century, but they argued that making the students memorize as dogma all these principles was not a rejection of rationalism. Because what they said was, in effect, an adult must eschew dogma. His deductions must start with, what they called intellectual intuition. Clearly understood, self-evident principles. But the child, they said, hasn't yet developed the power of reason. So he has no option but to memorize without understanding. Thereafter, however, in time, he will come to understand and follow what the teacher is telling him. Now, alongside their sincere admiration of ancient civilization, the classical educators were also pious Christians. And they could hardly equate the value of paganism, even Platonic paganism, with that of God and biblical faith. So they developed the view that education has an even higher purpose than intellectual development or sharpening of the mind, a purpose to which a child's mental growth and mastery of the ancients is merely a means, albeit a critical one. The purpose, they said, is moral, to create in the child a virtuous character. Now, as might be expected, virtue, as interpreted by these modern Christians, did on its face include both Christian and pagan forms of behavior. It was not Christian the way Innocent III would have practiced it. And the pagan forms became increasingly prominent as political freedom and the Industrial Revolution took hold in the West. Now, the classicists were not medievalists. They did not fight the new value trends, not in general. Indeed, as with education in general, they sought to subordinate these new trends as valuable but deriving from and depending on the transcendent. For instance, be self-reliant, they taught the students, at the point where the modern world was demanding it, but remember that character is a gift of God. Or be ambitious, but remember that self-sacrifice is going to be required of you. Or pursue happiness, but expect a life with a lot of moral struggle, which is necessitated by man's corruption and God's justice. Now, they carried this attitude over into the schools by saying that the student is not in school to enjoy himself, or even primarily to acquire knowledge. Primarily, he is there to learn to resist temptation and overcome his sinful nature. For instance, it was frequent for reformers to to come up with a means of simplifying Latin grammar so as to make its study easier and more enjoyable for the young child. Typically, the response I got from the Latin establishment was that it's a good thing that students find Latin difficult because their schooling thereby teaches them a lesson more important than Latin, which is how to bear hardship. Sort of speaks for itself. Now, the ultimate purpose of such education is, of course, religious, a lifelong orientation to God. So you could say that the classicist program is threefold: intellectual development as a means to moral development, as a means to a love of God. So the classicist mode of integration, the whole curriculum, along with the method of teaching it requires, is integrated by the principle that it's a logical structure, a ladder of necessary steps leading eventually to God, and the structure is made possible by the fact that all branches of knowledge were seen as flowing from God and therefore interrelated. So the many of this world, including all the separate areas, or most of the separate areas of knowledge, are real and properly demand attention and effort. But their ultimate integrator is the transcendent. And this integration, or this integrator, is reached first and last by our grasp of pure forms, by starting with the pure forms of grammar and ending with the pure form of God. In other words, by concepts apart from percepts. But not concepts wholly and permanently detached from percepts. Because the distinctive purpose of conceptual education in their official view, as contrasted with the medievals, in significant part is to open up for the student the empirical world of the secular pagans. So if you put that together, you see that that is clearly M1 in education, and it had the longest tenure since the Renaissance of any approach to education. All right, now the first real movement that started another trend, classical education started to disintegrate in the 19th century, and science took the place of the pagan literature, but no real approach to education. It was all just transition, took place until the late 19th century when progressive education took over, supplanted the traditionalists, took over decisively, especially in America, by the 1920s and 30s, and of course still highly influential today. And the big name there is John Dewey. Now, I've written a lot on Dewey, so I'm assuming that you know he rejects an external reality, and you know the pragmatic redefinition of truth. Now, in Dewey's view, and the whole view of progressive education, thought is an exception in life. It occurs only when some proposed course of action is blocked. So people feel a state of what he calls dis-ease. And therefore they think up an idea. And the definition of an idea is not any kind of abstract concept or principle, but a concrete, quote, plan of action, which can be tested only by action. If the plan, if the idea works, removes the block, enables the actors to gain the results they desire, then the idea is true, and if not, not. And Dewey adds, no idea can be known in advance of action to be the one that will work. We're constantly experimenting, and we have to see, and the ideas that worked yesterday may not work today. So this is the starting point of progressive education. What counts in human life is the needs not of the mind, not of man's rational life, but of unblocked action, whatever it is. Action is the primary, and that is how a student therefore must learn. He must learn by acting, or the more common phrase, he must learn by doing. Now, if doing is to take over the classroom, then the whole traditional classical intellectualist apparatus must be scrapped. There are to be no more texts, classical or otherwise, in the schools. No lecturing, no structured presentations to force on the child, no lesson plans. What we want is a room of youngsters in action. We don't want immobile students trapped at a desk, frozen and forced into listening, reading, memorizing, and taking tests. All that is out. Now, yesterday's teachers pretended to be cognitively superior to their students. But in fact, the teacher, after all, is just as much of an uncertain actor awaiting unpredictable results as the child. He's not an authority, cognitive or otherwise, but merely, as the Encyclopedia Britannica puts it, the teacher should be, quote, a helpful guide for the children's chosen activities, unquote. Now, the older teachers had conceived education, at least to some extent, as equipping the child for adult life. The progressives reject this view. Education, they say, is, quote, participation in life, not preparation for it. So, the progressive child is not stifled by adults. And he's ready at the outset for self-expression. And self here denotes a repository of interests, needs, desires, and spontaneous impulses. Now, left unpressured by adults, we're told, the child will be moved by, quote, the internally generated rhythm of self-development, unquote. But for this, he requires freedom, not as a temporary privilege, but on principle, as his birthright. He must have freedom in school and even freedom to forsake schoolwork. In the words A.S. Neal, the founder of the famous progressive institution Summerhill, education requires, quote, the complete freedom to play. The child must be free from the judgment and intervention of any adult, unquote. Now there's a catch here, though, because the progressive child, however free from adults, is not so free from other children. On the contrary, self-expression must be supplemented and sometimes even transcended by another goal. The child must learn adaptation to his peers. He must learn to see himself not only as a separate individual pursuing his own personal goals, but more significantly as part and servant of a larger whole, which ultimately is society. So the traditional schools Dewey held were too individualistic. In fact, fundamentally, the school should inculcate social spirit, social capacity, the desire for social service. And of course, they worked out many educational techniques to foster this goal. One popular one I'm sure you've heard of, is still very popular today, is the demand for group learning or cooperative learning and cooperative group grading, etc. Now you would think that self-expression and social adaptation are logically incompatible. Do what you want, no, do what the others want. But there is no incompatibility here, according to the progressive. The child they hold first comes to school as a bundle of selfish desires seeking gratification. But if the school offers appropriate social guidance, the child's desires soon begin to take on a social cast. Increasingly, he comes to identify with the group. His earlier self-expression turns into peer expression. So in a sense, his self has become the group. I want to clarify, though, however, that there's a big difference here between Dewey and the what's called the metaphysical collectivists, such as Marx or Hitler. Because for Dewey, the group is not a metaphysical entity. It's not the controller of a higher reality, in which he doesn't believe, or the agent of an inexorable history, in which he doesn't believe. On the contrary, the child's peers are merely a collection of uncertain actors who have no option but to reach consensus by reference to their own feelings, since there is no reality to which they can appeal. And these feelings, according to pragmatism, are always uncertain and mutable. So even a dissenter with unpopular feelings can sometimes sway the group's consensus. And that's okay with Dewey. So the individual, in short, must identify with and serve the collective, but he's not wholly swallowed up by the collective the way he is by communism or fascism. Now, to the issue of concepts, the progressive classroom is necessarily an anti-conceptual milieu. That's more than self-evident. The children are explicitly not to be guided by abstract principles or theories, but to be concerned with concrete situations one at a time so as to satisfy today's concrete needs. And if you talk to kids that are in those schools and you mention anything like abstractions or some theory, argument, that's just words. It's all semantics. If you give them a theory, their objection to theory is it's too theoretical. The reality they know, this concrete bound reality, is the very opposite of the classical educators. And they just dismiss classical education as simplistic. Their world is not a realm of connected abstractions, but of unrelated percepts, provisionally juxtaposed in some pattern until you get a disease and the needs of action change to some other pattern. Now, the progressive's perceptual level approach to education is carried out most dramatically in their distinctive curricula, in regard both to content and to method of communicating it. First of all, they say, do not divide the data of human knowledge into categories. Don't say, oh, there's geography and arithmetic and science distinguished from one another by old-fashioned abstractions. You see, those were subjects were distinguished in order to say, well, what they all have in common is this, and we're studying this as distinct from that. They were conceptualized. But now they say that is unrelated to concrete action. What if a child in a given situation needs a 1 point from one subject and 2 points from another, and he needs altogether to plunge in and out, and put his toe in and out of 4 different so-called subjects? Well, it's ridiculous to break them up into subjects. He should have access to whatever concretes he wants. So the schools can no longer be subject-centered. They must be, as it's called, child-centered. And you know that famous line, we don't teach Johnny, we don't teach history, we teach Johnny. And they could have added that we cover only the specific data he needs, not only from history, but plucked from whatever subject in order to carry out successfully his concrete project or undertaking at the time. Now, even when the progressives do allow some traditional subjects, you see the perceptual level approach pervading the whole curriculum. And I can't go in there now. I have discussed it to some extent in Why Johnny Can't Think, but just in a word to remind you, they insist on the whole word method of reading because phonics is abstract. They don't believe that you should teach general principles of science, but what they call, quote, hands-on scientific activities, which is just a whole bunch of experiments juxtaposed. Even mathematics, which was the one-time citadel of abstractions, is no more. Here's a quote from Wilfred Schmid, a professor of mathematics at Harvard. He could hardly believe that under the reign of this math, his daughter was not allowed to use the method of carrying tens in addition or subtraction, because that's, a broad abstraction. Quote, so he said, my Sabrina is reduced to drawing 39 little men to solve problems like 39 minus 14, unquote. And then she takes away 14 from the 39 and she counts how many are left. That, I think, is pretty much concrete bound mathematics. Now, critics often object that the progressive child does not learn facts or truths in school. And Dewey agrees and considers it a good thing. They quote from Dewey: "There is no obvious social motive for the acquirement of mere learning. There is no clear social gain in success thereat," unquote. Now here you see Dewey is an empiricist, but he's an empiricist obviously of the new purely Kantian variety. His goal is to demolish every aspect of education, even including teaching and learning. Now you can't, there's nothing left. And the way I would put it, I think this is a good formulation. His movement represents the anti-conceptual mentality confronting pre-conceptual children and working to keep them there for life. So what is left of education after all its attributes have gone is nihil, which is Latin for nothing. You can figure out what that would be if you add ism to it. So I think the essential mode of progressive education, the essential mode of integration, is obvious. It's the enemy of unity in every regard. It's the arch exponent of the many without the one. It's a clear case of D2. It is to education what modern art is to literature. Now, let's go on to another one. Despite progressivism's huge influence here, the general educational system in the United States did not go all the way. Dewey was injected in the traditional schools, but they the vast majority did not become progressive institutions. For 75 or more years after Dewey became the big figure, our schools have retained significant elements of a non-pragmatic approach to education. And the best name for this approach, I think, is pluralism. I call it the pluralist education. I originally called it the American education, but then I found it's everywhere, so I think pluralism is better. Now, pluralism is a general term. It's the position that multiplicity, in other words, the many, plural, as against singular, is ultimate. And pluralism is the view that multiplicity is ultimate. So it regards the quest to find unity in any field, to find logical connections among all its elements, as chimerical and wrong-headed. Now, previous educators, traditionally, had all been non-pluralists. They had an ultimate goal, and then everything else was worked out to achieve it. The ancient Greeks, for example, wanted the child to reach full self-development, and therefore a sound mind and a sound body through what they call music, gymnastics, and literature. The classical educators wanted moral and religious development through character formation and a sharpened mind. They all were focused on one goal, however broad, and then what was required to get it. And then, of course, the progressives threw out all goals. Now, what do the pluralists do? Well, they believe strongly in educational goals, but not in the, quote, monistic fashion of past centuries. Monistic meaning there was one ultimate, mono, one. The pluralists believe in a substantial catalog of educational goals. And some of them they think are optional, though worthy. Some are indispensable in all schools, but none are regarded as logically connected into one hierarchy or system. The goals of education, in short, are a many, which is taken as an ultimate. Now, here's a small sample. This is absolutely true because I culled it from various catalogs. A sample of such goals. These are not courses yet, but goals that the university promises to achieve for the students. Self-esteem, democratic citizenship, listening, racial tolerance, adaptability and flexibility, interpersonal relationships, and one of them offered, quote, spiritual wellness, unquote. Now, in general, if any contradiction seems to appear between these goals, their generality is reduced. In other words, they're redefined in ever more concrete bound terms. So, for example, if teaching self-esteem leads to assertiveness, which clashes with flexibility, which is another goal, then the child will be told self-esteem at home, flexibility with your peers. And then if you've got a problem with your mother and father, etc., you just keep whittling it down. Now, contrary to the progressives, this, what I'm giving you, is just a description of American high schools. Contrary to the progressives, today's educators do accept the need of academic cognition in the schools. But they do not regard this as the most important goal of education. For pluralism, there is no such thing as the most important or the fundamental goal. Cognition, like all the other goals, is one concern within a diverse many. And the attention it deserves in any specific situation depends on the context prevailing at the time. Now, political conservatives often claim that our schools do have one goal, and that is to disseminate left-wing propaganda. And now, no one can contest that that kind of propaganda has a huge influence in American classrooms. But I do not agree with this interpretation, that that is the goal that they're aiming at or even that they achieve. The pluralist approach to education preceded current political trends by more than half a century. And it's equally possible under conservative hegemony. The vast majority of our teachers, and I've talked to a number of them when my daughter was in school, do not regard any ideas, including their own, as absolutes. And they affirm quite sincerely that proselytizing is not their goal. In their view, they are simply expressing, as and when it seems relevant to a particular point in their subject, they're expressing the obvious. And if someone challenges it, many of them will say, oh, I never, okay, I didn't know there was a challenge. I don't believe that, but okay. Now, this does not affect the essence of the pluralist approach to education or to integration. Classical educators offered their students a relatively small number of subjects, and so did the Greeks, the ones dictated by their ultimate goal. And of course, the progressives dismiss the teaching of subjects. The American curriculum, in contrast, prides itself on being comprehensive. That's what they call it. It offers many more subjects than any previous schools in history had ever dreamed of doing. Pluralism in regard to goals necessitates pluralism in regard to curriculum. But I doubt that anyone could have predicted it to the extent of it before it happened. So you get the standard academic subjects, but you also find both at the elementary and the secondary level. And again, these were taken, I could have just gone on for an hour and a half reading titles, but I just grabbed a few here. These are actual courses offered for credit: holistic health, environmental stewardship, driver education, racquetball, leadership, wood technology, beginning photography, current affairs, and one college offers courses in, quote, joy and humor, unquote. Now, you ask yourself, what do you think, because I found out the answer, is the percentage of the students' time in U.S. schools devoted to this type of thing as against the traditional academic subjects, history, math, and so on. And according to what I read, 59% of the students' time is devoted to this type of thing, and 41% to academics. Now you can see, I think, that this is a non-conceptual approach to education. You cannot take as a leading principle of education the rejection of unity unless you first of all have set aside or rejected man's means of discovering unity. Now, the same pluralism dictates teacher training as well. Our schools of education are very intent on teaching the method of teaching. And there's an excellent quote from Jacques Barzun. I cut out almost all the good quotes in my lectures to get it down here, but the book has many, but some I couldn't resist. And this is from Jacques Barzun, who's a very good thinker. He's talking about the schools of education. There is a method for supervising schools and another for being a principal. Every subject matter taught has its own special method. Even janitorial method can be learned, and the method of teaching janitorial method also. Methods grow like fleas on one another ad infinitum. Now this is, talk about concrete boundedness, and it applies, of course, to the content presented by these, quote, methods as well. And I think I've given examples in my writing of teachers offering a random assortment of facts without context or hierarchy, and then drawing some low-level generalizations like the importance of the potato in mankind's discovery, and not even thinking of broader integrating principles. And that's why the students basically have no resort except the same thing the classical students did. Floating abstractions or concrete bounds, rote memory, which they then regurgitate on multiple choice tests, and they forget. Now, despite the strong influence of Dewey on American educators, they're by no means consistent progressivists. If they were, they wouldn't be tolerated by the general public. 59% okay, but if the kid can't read and doesn't know that, the United States had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, even today's public would rise up. So American educators do still demand certain conceptual integrating elements in the schools. As I said, they require academic subjects, however minimized. They assign texts, however much they're mostly pictures. They strive much of the time to lecture and do so logically, even though the lectures are disjointed because they're constantly interrupted by, quote, class discussion, which is regarded as primary. But still, they do not leave percepts wholly unconceptualized. They try to teach causes and some kind of generalizations, even if lower level ones. So, as in similar movements in other fields, conceptual shrinkage continues to go on, and that's the process which critics now describe as dumbing down. But there is still a significant conceptual element that would never be tolerated by a pure progressive. So I think you can see the attitude here. There is no one in the schools, but we don't deny every form of unity. There's many ones unconnected to the rest. Or we can put it another way. Insofar as they are indifferent to thought and reality, American educators are skeptics. But insofar as they do work to relate and conceptualize percepts, they are knowers. So, knowing skeptics, chunks of unity Within an unrelated many, it's obviously D1. So that would be the counterpart of naturalism in literature. All right, now totalitarian education. I want again to look at communism, and you'll see that it's very similar to what we said about literature, because totalitarianism, by definition, embraces all, embraces the total. And the first thing it wants to inculcate into the populace and to the child by any means is the ideology. So the education and the art are two different ways of achieving the same thing. But there's just the different angle that it's in school rather than in a novel. So totalitarian educators begin by brushing aside the whole past, educationally, as a corrupt legacy of evil groups. The schools, they say, must pursue a single fundamental goal, namely to create, for the first time ever, the dream of the ages, a nation of ideal men. And, of course, the ideal man is defined by his ideology. I quote you from Lenin, quote, "The entire purpose of training, educating, and teaching the youth should be to imbue them with communist ethics," unquote. So, of course, the education, therefore, must reject individualism altogether. And here's one sentence from a typical Soviet educator. Quote, "Textbooks must be thoroughly permeated with the spirit of collectivism. The children must get accustomed to view themselves as parts of a whole," unquote. The teachers, therefore, once approved by the state, proceed radically to reconceive every school subject so that it promotes the ideology of the state. Now, the most obvious example in the communist case is the teaching of history. The traditional idea of teaching historical fact objectively is rejected as counter-revolutionary. Rather, historical events, broad trends, and even details are to be taught as the expression of ideology. In other words, as a product of an antecedent conceptual system, which is the world's primary factor. They call that the laws of history, the dialectic process, and we'll look at that when we get to politics. But history, in short, is not a subject learned by scientific observation and study. On the contrary, we know from the outset, before we start studying it, that it's the inexorable march of the class struggle, capitalist exploitation, etc., and actually leads to even such concretes as Beethoven's symphonies, which we don't have to hear to know they're coming, or have come. There can be no question, therefore, of using so-called objective facts as a basis on which to validate the ruling ideology. The reverse is true. Ideology is not a slave of fact, but rather the criterion by which facts are to be determined. So-called facts which clash with the proper conceptual system, however plausible these alleged facts are at first sight, are by definition illusions caused by the lies of the enemy. So again, as with their view of literature, it's the idea of concepts preceding and controlling percepts. Even though these people are strongly anti-religious, they're atheistic, they have taken over the essence of Plato's approach. Floating abstractions as the true reality, the world of observation as an often deceptive and ultimately unreal flux. Now, in some form, this approach rules schoolrooms in every subject. In fields dealing with men, for example, such as psychology and biology, the Soviet teachers pushed Pavlov, and especially, contrary to all evidence, Lysenko, inheritance of acquired characteristics, because his viewpoint was seen as necessary to defend the Soviet view of the infinite malleability of human nature, and thus the possibility of the creation of a new man. You can easily look up more examples of this. Now, contrary to the D viewpoint, all subject matters and all facts in the totalitarian approach are necessarily related. They all flow from a single system of ideas. Most students immersed in this kind of intellectual universe intensively for a decade or more, now there are a few exceptional cases, but most students graduate with the feeling that the system, the ideological system they have learned, is omnipresent and omnipotent. No process of thought outside of this system they come to feel is possible. Only the ideology and the leaders who speak for it can serve as the foundation and the context of any inquiry. And that's the goal, to turn out that type of student. Now, in regard to enforcing discipline, totalitarian schools have little problem, because there were obviously plenty of fearful objects to invoke. But the emphasis in the schools was not primarily on inculcating fear, but rather in creating passionate inspiration, the passion to fight against all odds, if necessary, for the ideal life soon to come. And the fight was largely against and destroying the hated enemy group. In other words, the schools did not want timid believers who were obedient out of concern for their own personal welfare. They wanted truly loyal zealots and haters. Now, after school, as Ayn Rand illustrates in We the Living, the child was continuously surrounded by believers and zealots who piled him with activities and left him no free time alone. In other words, no time to think or question. He was completely booked from the time he woke up until the time he went to bed. So now a few unusual children could live through a decade or more of all this and yet emerge as thinking adults. But the vast majority could no longer even conceive of such a condition. To these graduates of the system, ideological conformity feels spontaneous, natural, self-evident, virtuous, while any independent approach feels instinctively inconceivable, unnatural, evil. So the child learns to place his mind enthusiastically at the disposal of the authorities, to become a will-less tool of the state. And thereafter he can exercise receptive, but not creative, intelligence. And that is the ideal man aimed at by the communist education. Now I want you to observe that the essential precondition of the whole communist educational project is its reliance on floating abstractions. If classroom material were based on observed facts accessible to the student, it would always be possible for him to spot discrepancies between the material being taught and the facts, and then to doubt or even challenge the teachers, at least in his own mind. But ideas taught to a student as freestanding entities without relation to observation or fact cannot be threatened by observation or fact. By definition, nothing in the student's own experience is relevant to their validity. The student can no more use his experience to try to understand the dialectical withering away of the state or the Aryan spirit than he could to understand the triune Godhead. All of those are floating abstractions. There's nothing in his experience relevant to them. So, deprived of the power of critical thought and of induction, the student can deal with ideas only by deduction, only by rationalistic means. starting with the axioms of the party and then parading the approved chain of inferences therefrom. For example, materialism is presented as self-evidently the only alternative to religion, from which then one deduces the labor theory of value, from which one deduces the exploitative nature of the capitalist, etc., etc. Now, I want to make a big distinction here between Dewey and communism in their theory of education. Despite the fact that Dewey was very briefly respected at the start of the Soviet Union, I want to stress the essential antipathy of the totalitarians to any form of deed. They do have one, no one can deny, very crucial thing in common. The nihilists and the communists agree in demeaning or destroying the intellect, to say no more. But the difference is this: the nihilist destroys as an end in itself. He has influence only among the intellectuals and the worst intellectuals. And even these dare not be too clear about their ideas in public. Dewey claims, for instance, he's a champion of, well, I'll leave that out. But the totalitarian, so he says. And this is the key to why totalitarians have a world following. He goes public, loudly and openly. He describes his horrors as regrettable, but a necessary short-lived means to an ideal world in which self-fulfillment for all will at last really be possible. He upholds an ideal, however vicious we think it is. The other one says, let's kill just to have corpses. There's a difference there in theory and a difference in their chance to succeed as a popular movement, which would be relevant to the last chapter of my book. Now, in regard to mode of integration, the communist approach, I think, is a clear case of the one without the many. The students, the different subjects of study, the world, facts, all of these are mere fragments or expressions of the single, ultimate, transcendent reality, the ideology, which is the one, that is reality, and that is the equivalent of the religious God. So it clearly is M2. Now we've reached the end of the road now in terms of extant, influential, long-lived cultural movements. But there's one that we never got to, and that is I in education. I don't believe I has ever existed in the modern world. I think it did in places in the ancient world. But I told you, if you remember, that I was obligated to at least sketch in what it would be, so you can see that the dim hypothesis would cover all the possibilities. By the way, I don't regard the Montessori method as a full theory of education. It has a lot of good points, but it's really only an anticipation for younger students. I call this education as conceptual development. Now, I'm obviously going to present an objectivist view of education, although, as I say, that's not the only education, but it is in the modern world. And I've already given the whole course on this, so I'm just going to mention those points that are needed to explain why it's classified as I. Now, in the objectivist view, education is monistic. It is concerned, in essence, with teaching only one cognitive skill. It wants to take the perceptual level toddler with whom one starts and turn him years later into a conceptual level grown-up. And why? Because reason is man's basic means of survival. Now, this is necessarily a secular approach to education because survival on Earth is the ultimate value, and concepts are regarded as abstractions from perceptual data. Teachers are concerned only with the child's ability to think about the world in which we live. And this task for an objectivist school entails two indispensable elements. The child must be taught a certain factual content by means of the teacher using a certain logical method. Now, the content is uniquely delimited. The only skills and subjects taught are those necessary to enable the child at maturity to function as a rational being, i.e. a being consistently on the human level of cognition. So, of course, the schools would include the 3 R's, but over and above these skills, in my judgment, an I curriculum would include only 4 subjects, all the way from elementary through the end of high school. Science, math, history, and literature. And I have a whole lecture on that if you want to look it up. The curriculum, therefore, is single-tracked and deliberately, quote, narrow. It regards many popular and even worthwhile subjects as time stealers, distractions from the single and very time-consuming purpose of the school. If parents want their offspring to learn music or the other arts, foreign languages, play football, whatever, I would say they should make their own private arrangements and keep it out of school. Above all, the curriculum should shun the cognitively premature. It should bar all subjects in which the student has not yet learned the facts and the methods necessary to reach objective conclusions. So the teacher would regard, quote, relevance in the sense of newspaper controversies studied in class as educationally harmful. And for the same reason, the school should omit college-level material, such as political science, economics, psychology, philosophy. Should omit it. Now, in regard to these advanced subjects, the teacher does give the child many of the concretes that will help to give him a grounding later. Sometimes factually through history, sometimes artistically projected through literature. And along with the simpler generalizations of which the logic the child can grasp himself. And then, of course, it becomes increasingly abstract the more information he gets. But it's up to the child when he matures, if he's interested, to seek a broader interpretation, like to seek out his whole philosophy or his political philosophy, etc. The school should not be teaching their view of philosophy. They should be teaching facts and method of thinking. And then it's up to the child when he gets old enough to decide this is what it means. Now, to achieve the purpose, the teacher, I'm very strong about this, must be a lecturer in class and not a moderator of uninformed student discussion. He should be in full charge of the class, intellectually and otherwise, because he is functioning as an expert in the subject matter and in the method of presenting it. I would allow marginal class participation for various reasons as helpful up to a point. Now, to develop the conceptual level method of thinking, the teacher has to carefully select and logically structure his material. And that involves a number of pedagogical principles. I explained in my course that the two which I regard as the most distinctive here are hierarchy and integration. And hierarchy, in essence, is going from observations to elementary concepts and early generalizations to underlying principles to broader and ever broader theories that help explain the earlier observations. Now, this kind of presentation would be strictly logical because it's derived from sense experience step by step inductively. So the student never encounters the arbitrary, the haphazard, or the floating, but only objective conclusions resting on perceptual facts. Now, if you want an example of the I method beautifully developed in physics, I refer you to the taped course given by physicist David Harriman. If that were done for every one of the crucial subjects, the perfect curriculum would be down on paper. Now, the other form of integration which I want to emphasize is that the teacher must connect. He must regularly point out the implications of one point or topic for others already taught, whether in his own classes or those of his colleagues, about which he should be kept abreast. After the necessary specialized study, in other words, the child must repeatedly be offered an ever broader overview, interrelating, so far as possible, all the seemingly disparate facts and abstractions involved in it. And of all the teaching I've watched, I'll just say parenthetically, the best expert in this was Marva Collins, who had I watched a room of, 6-year-olds, and everything that she said, just about, 5 kids would put up their hand and say, is that connected to so-and-so from history, literature, or whatever? They were so inculcated with the idea of integration at a very young age. It was a real pleasure to see. She stressed that in a way I've never seen since. Now, while the teacher wants the student to learn the method of thinking, he does not lecture on the method of thinking. On the contrary, he presents the content a certain way. He and the student is thereby exposed to the principles of rational thought in the form of what they are in countless specific cases. And the goal is that the principles of conceptual level functioning are absorbed by the student in the very process of learning content. They become automatized in his mind without the need of any highly abstract and premature discourse on, quote, how to think. So the way I would put it, the teacher does not expound a proper epistemology, he exemplifies it. Now, of course, the I teacher is highly directive, but it is essential to his goal of turning out independent thinkers that he not propagandize in connection with the material he presents. He gives the students in layers the relevant facts in various cases and the method of thinking about them. Then the rest later is up to the student. Now, I think you can see from this tiny little sketch the approach to the mode of education of this approach. I think it's clearly the one in the many. There is one purpose which unites the many distinct subject matters and one method subsuming many different principles of teaching. And all of it, content and method, flows from the nature and needs of man's one distinctive cognitive faculty. His need to unite many percepts, which percept is by definition worldly, into one man-made objective body of knowledge. So in this way, the many are real and they are integrated without any floating abstractions or transcendent pedigree. That is, in brief, what I think and I, from an objectivist point of view, would be. And if you ever read part 3, you'll get a Greek view of what an I education would be, which has an overlap, but they were just discovering concepts at the time, so they could hardly make that the essence of education. Okay, we'll stop here, and then we'll have the last one tomorrow on DIM in politics. Thank you. Yes.
In each of these, in most of the types of education that you discussed, there's a strong role of ethics in the goals of the methods. And I was wondering, I don't always see the connection to the mode of integration if you don't take it directly from the original three philosophers. So how, especially in the socialist ethics in progressive education, how does that come directly from?
Well, now, wait a minute. I didn't say that they were socialist, because socialism is a political system, and progressivism is an educational system, an educational approach. A lot of the progressives are socialist, but a lot of them think that politics is hopeless, and that they're just concerned with freeing the child, and that they have no commitment to any absolute. So you have to keep your levels clear. Now, it's true that every mode of integration has some kind of ethics connected to it. But it's not always the same kind of ethics. So what you see, most of these people accept Christian ethics, even if they don't accept Christianity. The whole thing about the modern world is that they never question religious ethics, even the founding fathers, while questioning the Christian metaphysics and epistemology. Now, so what they do is basically set it aside to create their achievements. That's true of everybody. You couldn't and Newton had to basically, no matter how much he upheld physical reality and discovered his laws, and he had to set God aside, and the idea of space and time as God's senses. If he had followed that as his primary, as essential to his physical system, he wouldn't have been able to achieve his physics. And the same with Hugo and God, and the same with Thomas Jefferson. If you read Thomas Jefferson on ethics, he is horrible. You can barely even find, a good sentence that you can pull out of context, and yet he was able to set it aside. So all of the modern, the best of the moderns, are Christian, and then of course they go on from there. Dewey, for instance, he's now one of the worst, and according to his philosophy, there should be no absolutes. Anything goes. Whatever works, works. And yet he was a Hegelian, and he simply took over as self-evident the primacy of society and of service to society. Whereas William James was a more consistent pragmatist before him, who actually launched Dewey. And he said the truest, whatever works, whatever makes you happy. And if living for society doesn't make you happy, okay, don't. So you will find a nihilist preaching Christian ethics. But that is not as impossible as it seems, because Christianity gives an opening to nihilism by saying that the essential element of ethics is self-sacrifice, giving up what you want, not asserting yourself, becoming humble. So it's a way of saying, wipe yourself out. So when a nihilist says, I agree with that, wipe yourself out, there's not that much of a clash. And Kant was a total nihilist in ethics. I wrote that, that's in the Ominous Parallels. When step by step through his philosophy. He believed in sacrifice, not even, allegedly to benefit society, but for his own sake. Just to destroy a value because it's a value. So, I can give you the ethics of the main philosophers, but what did you want? You want to know what the ethics logically entailed by the five types are?
Well, you were approaching this by taking the mode of integration as the essential, as the main driver of culture, and I was wondering how...
Because a method of thinking does not include values. That's an application. How you think about values, how you think about the state, how you think about art, is already you have to have a how you think. And therefore the mode of integration is all I'm concerned with. Now, all modes of thought entail certain conclusions when you think about values. But that is not something that I'm trying to present right now. I may or may not present that in part 3. If I do, it would be at the very end. And I would then look back and say, now, are there any values, that all these different movements are pushing forth? And how do they contribute to my idea of where we're going? But it would mix up the logic totally, because every ethics includes a politics. So instead of isolating the mode of integration, if I followed you, I'd have to say, and here's the ethics, and here's the politics, and here's the aesthetics, and here's the economics, and so on that follows from it. Okay, that's all I can say. Yes?
In your K through 12 objectivist approach to education,
Yes.
Would you see that you may not need through 12, that you may be able to clip it? Because we have people in school till age 19, for instance. And
no, I agree with you completely. In fact, in a misbegotten attempt to quantify that, I once tried to figure out how many years of school there would actually be. I can't remember anymore, but to reach the equivalent of what they're supposed to reach in high school. And I think it was over in grade 8. And you had your BA by 10 and your PhD by grade 13, and that was it. If they taught something and by the right method, there's so much time is wasted, such an incredible amount. It's a total waste. And of course, there's a huge bureaucracy. The teachers' lobby depends on extending education forever. So that education, now there's postdoc education. In my time, if you got to doctorate, that was it. Now, doctorate is just a step on the way. You have to stay in school until you're 50, which is ridiculous. I was over on this side, yes.
I understand what you're saying about conceptual education. I agree with it 100%. But you seem to privilege literature above all of the other arts. Now, I'm not arguing for teaching how to paint or teaching music theory, but I would think there's a place for teaching appreciation of those arts as well.
Well, I disagree with you. I put literature in for the sole reason that it is the only conceptual art, by which I mean concepts are its medium. Mm-hmm. So in order to grasp literature, you have to know how to read, how to interpret, how to get implications, and be able to express that in objective language. Now, I don't believe that there is such a thing as learning music appreciation in any way that enhances your conceptual ability or skill. I've taken a course in music appreciation, and I know you're going to tell me yours is better, but all I get is the teacher will say, let's start here and go through to here. Now, listen to this, and I want you to listen for how he modulates here, and how, he breaks the phrase here, and how the melody comes back here, and Then the class will say, yes, this is a surging excitement or black gloom or whatever, and that's it. I don't think any better, whatever. Whereas if I read a novel, I certainly do think better. If if it's a serious novel and I focus on it, I integrate because I'm using the conceptual faculty. Now, no, it really isn't. I was going to say it's conceivable to me that someday, but it really isn't, because those are non-conceptual. Those are perceptual arts. The medium is perceptual. I'm not putting them down in any way, but they're just not deserving of the time, which is so precious. There is so much to do in the four, what I regard as the four crucial subjects, and it has to be done so methodically that I don't see any reason why, if you think music appreciation is important, you don't teach it to the kid, or take them to concerts. Yes.
Have there been, or could there be other ideologies besides communism in M2? Like, could religion be taught? Could it become an M2?
Well, I have to. I'm trying to avoid that, but okay, I'll tell you this. I regard, and I have proved in terms of my part 3, when I go through the history, that the medieval Christian era was, in terms of mode of integration, interchangeable with communism. And they were, in fact, a source of it. And communism was just a pretended secularization, pretended because it's really just the same thing. It's got its Platonic world of forms and all the rest of it. But I'm doing the modern world now. The other place, and the modern world, Christianity is down, or was down, in the sense that in M1, as against M2, and then I'm trying not to give you all the parts, but it will come up again in my discussion of tomorrow, because there's no doubt that it is a very significant trend now, and that it has the eternal mode of integration that serious religion, always had. But I'm saying a discussion of it does not belong in the modern world. That is from the 17th to the 20th century. It's either before or it's after. And that's all we're doing now, the 17th to the 20th. That's why all M2 is totalitarianism, communism, and so on. You think I don't want to? How many times in my script did I say, and it's not only Stalin who said this, and then I'd quote some pope, can't do it, I have to wait, so I put it on the side. I got some popes that will stand up to any commissars. Yes, I think I'm on that side, yeah.
Would you say that in each of the 5 schools of education that the student ends up developing, or tends to develop, the same, the corresponding mode of integration habitually in his thought and life?
That's a good question. Let's go over them. Well, the Objectivist aims at that. When it's successful, that would be the result. It would depend, I guess, on how much flack he gets at home and from the world around him, and how much independence it requires. For instance, if you raised him by this method in Galt's Gulch, I think he would easily, the great majority would end up with that method of thinking. But if you take a kid who's shaken, has problems and so on, I think you can do a tremendous amount, but whether he's got to end up, I doubt it.
That's why I say tends to.
I say, yeah, tends to, I would say. Now, unless he just can't take being that different from others. Now, the kids from the pluralist schools that I've talked to are definitely very concrete bound. They can't imagine that there's any absolute truth. And so in that sense, but what it really comes out in them, not so much in how they think, as in contempt for learning, a contempt for knowledge, which is, as far as I know, almost distinctively American phenomenon. It's not so much that they have, bad methods, or that they agree that 39 minus 14 should be done this way. It's just generally they think that reading is a waste of time. You really can't know anything. None of it makes any difference. And then the better ones go off to the work world. So it's more eviscerating power. It's turning off their interest. It's devaluing cognition, which they have then for the rest of their lives. The classical ones, I don't really know how they came out, because the education was very brutal. These kids were really punished if they didn't memorize. And a lot of it they didn't understand. So they would almost necessarily have to throw it aside in order to function. They would always remember it, but I don't think their method of thinking would be, any equivalent in adult life of the primacy of grammar. I think they would always have a respect for the classics that nobody in modern times does. But if you interviewed them, I don't think you could tell, on something other than their school, you could tell as much about them. Now, the totalitarians, of course, I already said. Now, who did I leave out? Oh, the progressives. The only progressive students that I met were self-righteous about being concrete bound. They weren't, as you would expect, be uncertain and who can know anything. They were total dogmatists about the concretes that they were studying. You couldn't argue with them or talk to them. Whereas with the high school, the pluralist type, they're not sure of anything, but they say, "Oh, that's an interesting viewpoint." But the progressives were more, that was their religion, and you were the outsider. You're talking about subject matter and teachers, oppression, etc. So that's my best answer. Yes.
Given your concerns with excessive class participation, do you think that the Socratic method can play a role in a conceptual education? Can the teacher or professor still maintain his role as a educator with the Socratic method?
With a very small, very intelligent, highly motivated group where the teacher has a definite agenda, I guess it's okay. But what he's really doing in such a case is pulling out of the students what he would have given as a lecture. So he's not gaining anything. Now, I think there are various reasons why it's okay to make brief forays into the class, of which the first and most important is, do they understand what you're talking about? So if you every once in a while point at somebody and say, what would you think would follow from this? And he's in another dimension. And you usually get a feeling by whether, if you can see, whether the class is yawning, fidgeting, and so on. But if they're not doing too well, then you want to repeat and give more examples, etc. So you have to have some kind of feedback. You also, I think some class participation is necessary to keep them awake. Because it's very hard to listen to somebody else talk on and on and on, It's just not a normal human relationship. So what I used to do, without any warning, I had the class list, and I would say, and therefore Othello says, "What, miss?" And I'd give her name out of the blue. And she'd say, "Me?" I'd say, "Yeah." And once they know that could come, they pay attention. Another good thing is to go to the back of the room and lecture behind them when they're all looking forward, because they have an uncomfortable feeling that they're being surveyed, So there are some interactions with the class. You have to be sure they're with you. And you have to be sure that they're not, bored out of their mind. So that, you can figure that out. The solution to that is maybe you try to dole out one funny line every 5 to 7 minutes. And that lasts a few minutes before they decide it's boring, and then you pick them up again. Okay.
Can you clarify the relationship between thinking method as opposed to method of integration by taking an example from today and applying the objectivist, empiricist, rationalist trichotomy as opposed to the dim trichotomy?
Well, now you're giving me two different questions. Empiricism and rationalism are relevant to dim, but they're not the same thing. Because if I told you only empiricism is the view that there are no innate ideas and all knowledge begins with experience, and rationalism is the view that you start with a priori, self-evident principles, and deduce rather than induce, and that's basically the definition of those two. From those two, you cannot do cultural analysis. You could not possibly go and say, well, Dewey is essentially an empiricist, or you wouldn't have. What I say is there is rationalism and empiricism and Aristotelianism. And then the rationalism breaks up into two kinds, and the empiricism breaks up into two kinds. And the reason for that is that I'm defining them not simply on their starting point, but on the whole relation of concepts to percepts in relation to their view of this world or not. So it's a more complex approach. Obviously, I didn't originate empiricism and rationalism, but my approach yields 5, and the other give you only the very broad. You miss out nihilism altogether, and you would miss out M1 at least. Now, your question was, how do I distinguish a mode of integration with method of thinking? Well, the basic mode of integration is a way of specifying what you mean by method of thinking. Because if you just say, well, by method of thinking, I mean be logical, that doesn't yet tell you, is logic something that connects abstractions or what? Or if you say, by method of thinking, I mean observe, or base it on observation. Well, what is based it on observation? You generalize to what? You see what I mean? So it's more specific. It tells you exactly how a person views percepts, what he should base his knowledge on, and how it should relate to this world or some other. Now, you wanted an example of what from today's world?
For example, take Dewey and progressive education. So is it correct to say that Dewey himself was an empiricist in his thinking method, but the particular output, progressive education, his theory of education, that is misintegrated?
No. You got that completely wrong. Dewey called himself an empiricist, and he is, in the sense that all these nihilists throw out the conceptual faculty completely, but the point is they throw out the perceptual faculty also. So what they're left with is the total, not misintegration, a total disintegration, in which all you have is sensations. So that is a sub-empiricist. Okay, we'll have to continue tomorrow. Thank you.